So I am Ken Lertzman. I'm here speaking on behalf of the Link board, who is sponsoring this event. Thank you all for joining us in the celebration and launch of Izzy Harrington's new book, The Voices for the Islands, 30 Years of Nature Conservation on the Salish Sea. This is published by Heritage House Press earlier this year, and it is great pleasure that the Lasqueti Island Nature Conservancy celebrates the achievement of one of our own. To begin with, I would like to acknowledge and honor that here on Lasqueti, Lasqueti, we live and work on the traditional unceded territories of the northern Coast Salish people. Indeed, all of the area covered by Izzy's book is within the territories of the northern and central coast Salish peoples, and in the north also of the Kwakwaka'wakw. In her writing, Izzy has been respectful of and attentive to this historical context. To quote an example from the book about Denman, the Pentlach, Qualicum, Comox, and Slam people have had temporary or permanent summer camps on Denman Island for activities such as hunting deer, fishing for salmon and herring, and harvesting clams, oysters, and herring roe. Interestingly, one of the largest, most complex pre-colonial fish traps was unearthed by an earthquake in 1946 at neighboring Union Bay on Vancouver Island. And tragically, the Pentlach people were one of many First Nations that were devastated by both the 1780s smallpox epidemic and then a second wave of smallpox in the 1860s that killed between 50 and 90% of the population. Today, Salish, as they call it, is one of the indigenous names for what is now called Denman Island. Izzy Harrington is known to all of us here as a committed conservationist and community activist, but many people may not be aware of her deep roots in this kind of work before coming to Lasqueti. She's been working with BC Land Trusts for 30 years in various capacities. As founding executive director of the Land Trust Alliance of BC, she edited the Kingfisher magazine for 12 years. She wrote and co-edited numerous conservation resource guides and articles, and brought BC's land trusts together annually for over 13 years at provincial conferences. During that time, she was co-author and co-editor of the award-winning book, Islands in the Salish Sea, Community Atlas. Izzy was a director of Lasqueti Island Nature Conservancy for over 12 years, where she published our newsletter and managed our finances, in addition to her tireless work on many other projects. Now that she's stepped down as director, she is continuing as editor of the Link newsletter. She loves boating, hiking, birding, natural history, gardening, making art, and playing music with friends. Izzy's book has been received enthusiastically and was on the BC bestsellers book list last week. Wow. It has been the subject of many glowing testimonials, and I'll read only one here by Rick Careless, who is one of the giants of conservation in BC and a founding member of the Sierra Club of BC and the BC Parks Foundation. He says, in Voices for the Islands, Sheila Harrington chronicles the legacy of many dedicated local activists who worked for over 50 years to build the land trusts, conservancies, and precious wild sanctuaries that now safeguard the very soul of BC's Gulf Islands. She documented what these nature heroes did against daunting odds, employing land covenants, scientific research, and innovative fundraising and effective advocacy to save nature from development. As such, she also provides a how-to guide. This is an impressive, engaging book. I highly recommend it. If you care about passing nature onward, Voices for the Islands is a must-read that I suspect may inspire you two to join the action.
How's the sound for the back row people? Good. I see some people outside still. Is there any way you could come in? I don't want to. Ken, come on in. You can find a spot, I'm sure.
He can hear.
He can hear? Okay. All right. Well, hello. I'm honored to see so many of you come here and hear about the book and listen to me read a little bit from the book today. I had originally intended to read 3 sections. Well, I'm going to read 3 sections. Not from Lasqueti, because I figure you can get the book. But also, I didn't want to quote from people that were here, but it turns out that's going to happen anyway, because I'm going to start my section with Bowen Island. And John Rich, who is a big part of that story, is here today. So thankfully he's okay with me quoting him. I want to say thank you to Link for hosting this event, and also to Wendy Rickwire here, who made this book come to life. She really did. And of course, my husband Gordon, who was my first reader. And I also want to acknowledge my 3 crew members over the 3 years that I sailed to all the islands. Jack Barrett, who's standing out there in the back. Heather, who's over here, and Dawn.
Yeah.
And then one more thing before I get into the reading is over here, and these are in the book. These are maps that show the change between 2000 and 2022 in terms of conserved land. So if you get a chance, or you get the book, you can look in the book. It's a really nice visual a visual show of how much land has been conserved in the last 22 years. Okay, so I'm going to start with Bowen. Move this like this. Okay. I completed the last leg of my conservation sailing journey in July 2023. Sailing downwind through a lumpy northwester, it took 6 long hours to reach my destination, Bowen Island, on the outer reaches of Howe Sound. Squamish Nation elders unveiled a new sign at Snug Cove, welcoming visitors to Netlexwam, Bowen Island, in 2021. It was a fitting gesture, given that the island is an integral part of the Squamish territory. Surprisingly, Bowen Island, in the coastal western hemlock zone, has a higher level of mature and older forest than the islands in the coastal Douglas fir zone. Given its proximity to Vancouver's 3 million people, one would think the island would be more suburban. The saving grace is the Crown Lands, found on 3 high peaks, Mount Gardner and Mount Collins, plus the large 395-hectare ecological reserve on Apodaca Peak in the southeast side. The latter rises next to the small marine access at a provincial park. These crown lands comprise 40% of the island's land base. Due to these high mountain peaks and the logging, which happened earlier than on the more remote Gulf Islands, 58% of the forests are between 80 and 250 years of age. I nestled in the shade of these forests on my hot summer visit and stood in awe at the base of one of the biggest trees I'd found on the islands. Unlike the drier coastal Douglas fir, Bowen and Gambier have far more rain than the islands they face across the Salish Sea. When I arrived at Snug Cove and its neighboring Qualicum, also known as Deep or Mannion Bay, I was struck by the extent of development, with numerous close-knit houses and many private docks. At Snug Cove, hourly ferries arrive full of day trippers, residents, summer residents, and contractors. Just up from the terminal is a hub of commercial stores and restaurants that I hadn't seen on any other island beyond Salt Spring. A bald eagle called my attention to the forested south shore of Snug Cove. Low-flying herons and seals draped on the rising rocks of Qualicum's southwest shore, revealing a continuous rock embankment that leads to a public causeway installed a century ago, which is a lagoon and the island's terminal creek. After the Second World War and the arrival of the Blackball ferries, later acquired by BC Ferries, the Union Steamship Company started to sell some of their cottages, including one along the waterfront, sold to the grandparents of a pioneer conservationist, John Rich. For more than 50 years, John Rich's family has lived in the same house near Snug Cove. He's seen a lot of change. Early in our conversations, he remarked, "If it wasn't for the threats to the natural environment and enjoyment of it as a natural place, I'd probably be a retired carpenter." Instead, John lived a far from quiet life, as he went on to be the chair of the island's trust for 6 years. After that, he became a lawyer and worked with several First Nations on litigation of historical claims and Aboriginal rights. Today, John is on the board of the Bowen Island Conservancy. John moved with his wife to live full-time on Bowen in 1973. He said, "Kim and I were just putting roots under us when we found that a developer wanted to put thousands of houses on the neighboring property and urbanize the place. Stan James, a developer with a deplorable track record, purchased 1,500 acres of the former steamship lands, stretching from north of the largest lake on the island, Killarney Lake, down to the former resort lands near Snow Cove. James bought the land by securing private mortgages at 25% interest rates, counting on a quick sale of some 3,000 housing units, golf courses, etc., that would generate the funds for payments, along with a substantial profit. A pro-development director of the Greater Vancouver Regional District implemented a zoning bylaw that would allow 10,000 quarter-acre lots and a lodge on Bowen Island. Shortly after, in 1969, the provincial government's 10-acre freeze on the islands resulted in the GVRD and the province putting a hold on the bylaw. John had much to say about the antics that the developer Stan James used as people holding the mortgages started to get concerned. John explained, James owned the community's water system as well as part of what he purchased, and he was threatening to cut off the water. He also threatened to cut off access to his property, which had been used for recreation forever by Bowen residents. The first thing he did actively was close a causeway that goes between the lagoon and Deep Bay. In order to get from Deep Bay to Snug Cove, you have to walk on the causeway. Lots of people lived on the other side, and the community had been using it for over 50 to 60 years. So he built a chain link fence. People hauled it down. That's when I became active in 1975 in Bowen Affairs, John told me. We were particularly affected by the causeway closure, and I had a problem with his attitude and proposal. We formed a committee for causeway access to fight back. This got me more involved in the local political scene. Then I got involved in the local advisory planning committee. Using that springboard and level of interest, I ran in 1976 for the newly minted Islands Trust, with another new trustee supportive of putting an official community plan in place which would include recreational and conservation values. With the developer under duress from the mortgage holders and the new official community plan that called for rural rather than urban development, James decided to start logging from Snug Cove over to Killarney Lake, the largest lake on Bowen. The community had always seen this area as environmentally and recreationally significant. With virtually no control over actions on private land, John convinced the 3 general trustees appointed by the province to request a stop work order to stop the logging under the BC Environment and Land Use Act. The act was a lucky route for Bowen. As John said, it was only used 3 times across the province, then rescinded. John described the intense days during the community's protest against James. In the winter of 1977, James was trying to get a logging operation in. He got a cat too large to go on the ferry, so it was delivered to Sandy Beach, Deep Bay. A smaller logging show came on the ferry with a skidder and a small cat with about 4 guys. They went to a place where the contractor had things stored. Everybody knew logging was imminent, the beginning of next week, so we had 3 to 4 days. Along with others in the community, we decided to have a demonstration and try to interfere with the logging and hope the province would agree with our resolution for the stop work order. Stanley Burke, a member of a Vancouver family who, with a couple of other families, owned a 600-acre piece of land on the southwest corner, was sympathetic to the struggle. He owned various small newspapers and had worked for the CBC. He asked John what they planned to do. Show up and stand in front of the bulldozers, we said. John described the resulting dramatic event. Burke, the newspaper owner, said, "We'll make it presentable for TV. Use fire extinguishers and stop the engine." He sent us a bunch of fire extinguishers. He sent us a bunch of media, too. At 7 a.m., 50 people were standing out where the logging was going to start. Up the street came the Sun, the province, 3 TV and 1 radio station. They were pissed off to come for householders and hippies, but we were delighted. The loggers showed up and a bulldozer driver, and we stood in the way of things. This small outfit started their machines and drove forward, but the driver told his guys to stand down and get out of the way. But the bulldozer driver was storming. Stan James' manager showed up, who was a great big guy, very hostile. He showed up drunk, with coffee and something you could smell in it. We tried to make a deal with him to stop until we met to negotiate plans for the land. He agreed to that, and we wrote it out and both signed. We were pretty naive. Then he realized what he had done and he tried to snatch it back. The TV gets the action. The agreement was to stand down, but the bulldozer driver doesn't agree. He doesn't have the keys, though, as someone has taken them. Assuming things had settled, someone throws the keys back to him because of the agreement. But he starts his bulldozer and drives into the crowd with people on his blade, a potter and a 13-year-old gal. He drives trying to shake them off. The whole crowd is running along beside. TV cameras are getting it. He stops at the precipice. The potter's wife climbed over the track and grabbed the driver, who punched her, following which the potter climbed over the machine from the blade and slugged the driver. This is all on national television news that night. Just as this was happening, a radio operator came in and said, "The stop work order just came in." John explained how the land eventually became a regional park. A group of islanders created a society, the Park and Store Use Society, with its goal to establish a park and save a heritage building, which is now the library. John felt this was a long shot because the province wasn't making parks in those days, and the GVRD had just adopted a park plan with no more room in it. But that didn't discourage people on the island, and we lobbied and negotiated to do whatever we could. Eventually, we managed to work with the GVRD to make a deal with the province to purchase 700 acres out of James Holdings. At that point, his mortgages were held by Crippen Engineering, who got burned badly. They had a stop work order and an angry community. The GVRD chairman, Jim Ton, sealed the deal with Crippen when he suggested, "How about $2 million and we'll call it Crippen Park." Today, Crippen Regional Park is 240 hectares, including Killarney Lake, all along Terminal Creek, leading down to the lagoon behind Qualicum, or Deep Mannion Bay. The park also includes extensive trails leading from north of the lake down to the lagoon to the older causeway. It contains the Terminal Creek Hatchery, Fish Ladder, and Bridal Veil Falls, out to Snug Cove and beyond to its end at Dorman Point. The acquisition of Crippen Park is a perfect example of how local people, with patience and persistence, can conserve land in their own communities. So has anyone got any questions? So I got 3 sections to read. That was the first one. There's a short 5-minute one next, and then another 11-minute one. So, anyone got any questions?
Who is John?
Sitting right beside her. Poor John, he had no idea this was happening. He pulled in with his boat and asked Ken and Dana to come for dinner, and they said, "Wait a minute." Any other questions? That's just a very small part of the Bowen chapter. There's a lot more that went on Bowen, but I was just picking little bits for the readings. A lot more people did a lot of amazing things on all these islands.
Yeah. Would you say that that's the attitude still, that they're still so enthusiastic about protection on Bowen as now today as they were then?
It's different, but our conservancy has been quite successful in recent years. There's some very wealthy people in Bowen Island, which has helped us, and we bought 30 acres of waterfront land in the southwest part of the island a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, and it's called the Wild Coast Nature Refuge, and we're now getting close to buying another 240 acres, or probably we won't get that, 160 acres more to add to that. So we have some land donated.
Nice.
Nobody's standing in front of bulldozers anymore.
How big is Bowen Island?
Uh-oh.
Because I didn't think it was that big.
It's about 3/4 the size of Lasqueti.
3/4.
That's a population, the population now.
4,500.
Samantha, hi.
Hi, I wanted to ask on Bowen, there was a large piece of land that was, I think, purchased and potentially was gonna be developed, but the GVRD has purchased it, I think, and they wanna do camping, a campground there, and I just wondered what John thought about that and what's happening with that.
I'm sorry, John, I didn't.
The population on Bowen was very hostile to the camping proposal because the ferry is already overloaded, seriously
Yeah.
overloaded on a continual basis. And about half the people on the island signed a petition against it, and Metro Vancouver is basically bailed, and that land that I'm talking about us trying to buy, I can't say much more, but we've had a number of negotiating meetings with them, and we're hopeful that we're going to.
Of course, I picked dramatic, exciting stories, and here's another one. And this one takes place on Salt Spring. Maureen Milburn is one of Salt Spring Island's local heroes for her work in conservation. With 6 other women, she started the Salt Spring Island Conservancy in 1994. They were motivated to do something about the lands on the island that were being cleared and developed. Maureen told me that the Conservancy's formation came out of several streams. First, to their horror, Macmillan Lodell sold 3,000 acres of the island very cheaply to a local of disrepute who came in and logged it. Maureen said it was traumatic, with Mac Blow originally offering to save some areas for parkland in return for tremendous development. Islanders lost that area, but it motivated these women to come up with ideas to stop it ever happening again. The second stream came from a landowner, Martin Williams, who offered some of his land as a donation and the rest at a reduced price in order to conserve it. Maureen and Fiona Fluke, another of the founding women, went to the Saturday market, raising money so they could purchase the property in partnership with the Islands Trust. However, Martin wasn't satisfied with the option of the land going to the regional government because they could not promise to protect it in perpetuity. He wanted to have a local organization protect his land forever. The new conservancy quickly became involved in a very dramatic campaign to conserve a piece of land that was owned collectively by 10 partners. Like a bad marriage, over time, things were not turning out as planned for this group of landowners. The Mill Farm is an area on the southwest side of the island with rare stands of old-growth trees. With the zoning at third reading, 2 of the owners repudiated the group's internal bylaws. Bob Twaits, one of the children of the divorce, as he called them, told me that with the help of Ian Clement, a very generous lawyer who donated his time, we attempted to reconstitute the group's bylaws in a legally binding form. Sadly, despite many extensions to give the group time to reform, the 2 aggrieved most recent purchasers went to court because they had no way to sell, use, or enjoy their shares. All owners would be compelled to sell through the Partition Act. This is similar to a legal settlement for people co-owning a home when they can no longer live together. Bob suggested that the Salt Spring Conservancy bid to buy the land. By now, the Conservancy had acquired legal status, so back to the market they went to raise more money, this time for the 160-acre mill farm. Because they decided to take pledges in case the deal didn't go through, they were sitting with money promised but nothing to take to the courthouse. Maureen explained how the drama unfolded. We had a snap decision by the court that it would be heard on Wednesday. They phoned me on the Friday before and said, "You have to turn up in court on Wednesday, and your money has to be in the provincial government coffers by Monday." We were sitting with hundreds of pledges, from $50 to $500, but we couldn't get them in time. So I thought, oh my God, what are we going to do? Okay, we need to put in $100,000 by Monday. All we need is 10 people with 10,000, call them and ask them to lend it to us. I got the list, and the first person I called was Barry Coleman. He said, "Don't worry, I'll lend you the money." I thought, oh, this is fantastic. The next person I called had a ton of money. I told the story to them and explained, this is just a loan. This person turned me down. I thought, oh no, this is going to be hard. Then the phone rang, and a local woman, Gay Alcoff, said, Maureen, I understand you need 100,000. Come over this afternoon, we'll lend it to you. We went over, and she and her husband said, we actually just want to give you the money. And that was it. We had the money for court. Before Monday, someone else gave us an extra 50,000 in case you need it. The second bidder was a Washington State logging company. They had the capacity to increase their offer to win title to the land, but the new conservancy didn't. Bob offered to put his own share into the young conservancy's hands, but a surprising turn of events transpired. The owners all stood up in court and said they would take the lower bid. And the judge, Justice Alan McEachern, said, this isn't a democracy, but I'm inclined to accept the slightly lower offer. That was wonderful. Maureen said that the heroes on that day were the landowners who accepted the lower offer. Any questions about that one? Okay, so we'll move to Pender Island. Leaving Burgoyne Bay off Salt Spring Island was like pulling teeth. I longed to stay and bathe in the Douglas fir forest and Gary Oak woodland we had protected over 20 years ago, but I needed to get to my next destination, the Pender Islands. This was one of the first communities to take action themselves to conserve a very special place of ecological and community importance. The story of Pender Islanders' successful conservation of threatened places starts with Medicine Beach. It was the first protected place on the Gulf Islands, conserved by local islanders and a newly formed conservation land trust. The sheer number of people involved, their creative ideas, their determination, and their ability to bring in a multitude of sources to help them raise $500,000 to protect a property which to them had immense ecological significance in little more than 6 months is incredible. The cost and effort seemed beyond the reach of such a small community in 1993, but these people had perseverance and optimism. The 20-acre Medicine Beach property is at the head of Bedwell Harbor, which lies between North and South Pender Island. Medicine Beach is known by the Sanak First Nations as Eho. With an extensive archaeological midden that stretches along the shoreline, it has a long history of use as the historical location of a summer village site of the Sanak people. For the people of the Pender Islands at the time, it had its own strong medicine. Dr. Don Williams led the fundraising committee of 10, who worked tirelessly for 6 months to secure the property owned at the time by the Atkins family. Everyone I talked with about this project stressed that the wetland and beach were key to its attraction. Don described it as a marsh jewel. He and Carl Hampson, another member of the committee and one of the early founders of the Pender Island Conservancy Association, explained why the community would want to protect it. According to Dr. Don, as he's affectionately known on the Penders, the impetus was that we were a wild place with at least one drinking establishment. There was a pub on South Pender, long before Poets Cove and Browning Harbor. It was a pretty wild place on the weekends. I used to be the doctor, so I spent a lot of Saturday nights sewing people up. Amongst the conversations Carl and I had was, we don't need another pub. That was a bit of a conversation between them, those who wanted to buy the Atkins property and set up a marina, and us. Shelley Easthope, from the family who built the famous Easthope marine engines, was in the us camp. She spent her life near the ocean with a close connection to the land her family owned above Medicine Beach. She said, we had a lot of respect for the land, the fish, and especially the marshland. We were steeped in how important it was. A lot of people don't see that, but when you live close to it, you know it. Shelley recalled a day that the new fundraising committee met with the Atkins over lunch. The matriarch of the family said they had been approached multiple times while they held the land by someone wanting to purchase it to turn it into a marina, because that's what happens on this type of land on these islands. Shelley explained that the family knew how precious it was because development, especially of sites on the waterfront, was happening everywhere. The fundraising committee was key to the project's success. Dr. Don Williams described them as real optimists, each with a job based on their skills and interests. Those whose profession was writing, editorials, and university people were the writing division. Some brought muffins to the meetings. 2 or 3 would go give a talk at one of the clubs to answer questions. They brought in a professional fundraiser who advised them to make the campaign short. They decided on 6 months. They brainstormed about how to get the community to come up with the needed funds. Dr. Dawn explained their communication plan and next steps. We talked big about the total package of $500,000. That helped, as everyone thought that was daunting. It became clear we needed a biological survey. Jan Kirkby, a biologist who lives on Pender, did an initial assessment of the marsh, including identifying the different ecosystems and species she found in this rare place where freshwater and saltwater meet, with a cattail marsh at the back. Don Williams reiterated the values of the marsh. The biologists were starting to see that these wet marshes were not just valuable for the ecology, but also in recycling hazardous things, natural filters of metals, and other nasty things we were putting into the environment. That got people's attention in the early press releases. Lawrence Pitt, the link between the fundraising committee and the conservancy, wrote many of the formal grant applications. He said that the community had raised funds for decades for things, but this was the first eye-popping amount. He described how they brought in local donations. As it began to go forward, it had a magic of its own. We were in the right place at the right time. It was so gratifying to pull it off. The whole community got really active. Dr. Dawn devised this idea, a list of deep pockets on the island, and we would go and visit them. Our initial idea was they would bone up. It sort of worked, but the community was doing it at smaller scales. But one bigger donor, Ursula Popo, and a local pharmacist, stepped up with $10,000 each, so that really catalyzed a lot of energy. Another donor I recall was May Moore, the singer-songwriter. Her father donated his boat, one he had built and loved, but at the time he was in the last stages of cancer and had very little energy. When we went to say hi to thank him for it, his eyes just lit up. Dr. Dawn and myself, Lawrence Pitt, and the father were outside talking boats. May Moore and her mother were saying, "Come in out of the rain." And he said, "In a bit, we're talking boats." Dawn was a boater too. It really helped to galvanize the community. This was happening at the same time as the purchase of Jedediah Island. They learned that a landowner could get a tax receipt for reducing the price equivalent to donating it for conservation. Lawrence told me during our telephone interview that the family made the biggest donation of $127,000, making it feasible to raise the rest. Lawrence said, "The first big chunk came from the Nature Conservancy of Canada and Wildlife Habitat Canada for $60,000. Once we knew we could publicize that, we could get the community active in thinking about how we could do it. Thanks to Lawrence and Don Williams and many visits to Victoria, they secured a grant of $78,000 from the BC Habitat Conservation Trust Fund. Don Williams described some of the details of the events and individual meetings that resulted in hard-won donations toward the purchase. We worked hard all winter. We wrote to all the foundations. We got every community club on the island to put on one event, and each of the board members put on one event. Groups such as the Girl Guides put on a fantastic dinner evening. The committee members turned out in tuxedos for the fancy dinner. All these little events turned into a huge amount of public interest and support. The Lions Club, all the clubs donated. These events really caught the attention of people with deep pockets, and we would go see them personally. There was a guy who built downtown Vancouver, George Coates, who owned a coal mine in Alberta. He said, "You're going to fail. But okay, I'll take you on. I'll make a donation. Come back in May after winter. We'll see how you've done. I will then donate a sizable chunk." Another old-timer said, "What the hell do you want that swamp for?" I thought, these are just things we can build on. Curmudgeons, answer their questions and sharpen our approach. We did, and Coates paid up. An entire community got behind the protection of a relatively small 20 acres of land, because this was the first conservation acquisition initiated by locals as early as 1993. It was a coming of age for the land trust community on the islands. They were self-organized at first, then they worked with the local conservancy in the end. To raise additional funds for the acquisition, artists donated their watercolor paintings of the wildlife of the marsh. They hosted a home, garden, and points of interest tour and a barn dance. Lawrence described the barn dance. They had a huge potluck dinner. The fire department had a big bonfire for the youngsters. The folks from the realty office headed up the bar. and a fabulous bluegrass band entertained the 700 people who showed up. We raised $18,000 that night from an island population of 1,100 people. The community rallied behind the campaign, consolidating new friendships, having a great time while raising the funds. Doreen Ball described the first event. Carl Thompson's first Medicine Beach fundraiser barn dance was a real hoot. Cars were parked in the sheep pasture. Holly Arnson and friends played. Pat Sundahl sat at her treadle sewing machine and made a down quilt throughout the dance, sold tickets for it, and presented it to the winner at the end of the night. James Barber put on a fancy $100 a plate dinner for 50 at Stanley Point. Doesn't seem like much money now, does it? Angela Southward organized a dinner theater event where the fundraising committee turned out in fancy clothes and tuxedos. Doreen described the 90s and early 2000s as a renaissance time, when the stars lined up and there was an assemblage of people living here with just the right backgrounds and skills to do whatever was needed to save several parcels of land. I recall the stunning map created by Michelle Marsden of Medicine Beach, which was published in Giving the Land a Voice, mapping our home places. Doug Stanley did watercolors and small paintings. Kevin Oakey did a beautiful poster, which is still being sold by the local conservancy in its new storefront office today. Lawrence Pitt described the culminating event, which ended with, of course, a big celebration. At the end, we had a big event at Clam Bay Farm. We had a stage and music, food and dancing, and the premier, Mike Harcourt, came and brought the check over from his minister. We said, we're just short the total amount that we need. The amount missing was $58. This was just the amount the local brownies had raised the weekend. So the brownies put us over the top. It was the right time, a coming of age of this community, setting the stage for future stuff. Today, Medicine Beach is protected for its wildlife and ecological values and is still a beloved area for Pender Islanders. The marsh is partially fenced with beautiful illustrated educational signage outside near a parking area. The forested area has a trail and stairs. The beach is still accessible with the road coming down to the parking area. The Pender Island Conservancy and local islanders did the work of raising the funds and then passed the title to the Islands Trust Fund, now Conservancy, who now own the property, while the local Pender Island Conservancy manages and monitors it. As you can see, these are very exciting stories. And of course, those are the key dramatic ones. Any questions? Oh, just let you know, I'm going to be going back to the Southern Islands in my boat August 1st for 20 days, sharing the stories with all the islanders that I talked to originally over the 3 years that I did this little sailing escapade. And doing similar events like this on each one of them. So I've got a busy time ahead.
Was there a moment that hatched the idea for the book in your head?
Yes, definitely. It unfortunately was someone died who I had worked with the Land Trust Alliance of BC and was one of the founders of the Cowichan Community Land Trust. And so when he died, it was just a big shock. I had talked to him a couple of weeks before he died because he had brain cancer and decided he didn't want to carry through. And so anyway, that kind of made me go, wait a minute. Here's all these people, and I'd heard of 3 or 4 other founders of the Land Trust that had passed on. And so I kind of thought, wow, we're losing these important people, and this story needs to be told. And so that was the event that got me going.
And when was that?
3 years ago.
So then you just launched in?
Well, yeah, sort of. I mean, I knew a lot of people because of my position with the Land Trust Alliance and working with them over 13 years. So, you know, I just started calling people up and saying, you know, I'm going to come to the island. Could I interview you and some of the other founders of your organization? And so they met me and in the book I described, you know, going to each island and what I saw in the bays there and the people I met and what I thought and then what they said. So it's kind of a full meal deal that, you know, the big thing is their voices and their stories of what they did. I mean, you heard about what happened on Bowen, what happened on Salt Spring. Those of you that are at the Arts Fest heard about the crazy things we did on Salt Spring to pretend we were going big. People have done so much, and it's so delightful to be able to share their stories in a broader way to each other and to the broader world. Andrew.
I'll ask you something. So the stories are amazing, and there's some common threads between these ones, and I'm sure other ones. Looking forward, what if someone, some young group or some new group was trying to conserve something? What advice would you give them to get them to be motivated, to not despair about price, to not despair about the gap between where they need to get? So there's all these elements. It's a lot of work. So what would you tell someone who says, we want to protect this thing? We've got 10 people who want to start, and you've got a lot of knowledge about what worked from all these interviews.
Well, to believe in it and go for it, for sure. I don't think, there's not too many failures, believe it or not. I mean, and although there are a few, like on Salt Spring when Matt Lowe logged, well, they didn't log it, they sold it to a local guy who's throughout the book. His name is Jenks, and he did a lot of logging on a lot of islands. But to have faith, definitely get organized and definitely contact the local conservancies, because there is one on every island now, except for sort of Saturna, because Saturna is 50% Gulf Island National Park Reserve. So they don't really need a conservancy that much, but they've got what they do need, which is a marine research and education society called CIMRES. And they're doing amazing things, which you can read about in the book, including they put up hydrophones, so at any time you can go online and you can listen to the whales going by. I mean, it's amazing. The website is called spyhawker.ca. And so if you want to be amazed about the whales going by Boundary Pass, just check into that website. And they have done so much amazing work. Okay, I'm getting distracted. Your question, back to your question. What to tell them what to do is talk to the local conservancy, talk to other conservancies. Here on Lasqueti, we're lucky enough to have BC Parks Foundation working with us now, and Point Young was protected thanks to them. And so there's bigger players too that one can talk to. With the price of land being as high as it is today, it's actually a good idea to talk to some of those bigger players.
I really like what you said at the beginning, which is there aren't that many failures, so that's the biggest thing. How are we ever going to do this? Well, if you do it, you have a high success. So just, I think that's great.
Yeah, and of course the fundamental thing is all these properties are private properties that are purchased from willing landowners. So you can't deal with anyone who isn't willing. There's no point. You've got to deal with willing landowners who are interested in conservation. They want to pass their land on, and so if you go talk to them, they'll take an interest. And there are, and these are explained in the book a lot too, many tax strategies that help those people. So that if they donate a portion of their land, like in that Pender section where it was 127,000 of the 500,000 was donated by the landowner, they get a tax receipt for that. That offsets, because they're making the 500 or the 120 less 127, they're going to be taxed on that. And so the tax receipt gets rid of them. And if you make the land what's called an ecological gift, then you actually don't get any of the capital gains taxes. So, this is all, roll your eyes, complicated at this point. But what I'm saying is there are tax advantages as well. So there's lots of good things that can happen. Gordon.
Izzy, was there a common theme or thread amongst all these people that you interviewed? Was there an event or something that triggered?
Oh yeah, you want me to talk about Clayoquot Sound? Yes. It was amazing to me how many people I talked to had been at Clayoquot Sound. They had been there, they saw, the impetus that people really did care, and they came back home to their islands and said, oh, look, this area is threatened. We got to do something about it. There was a number of people that were all, Clayoquot Sound started their organization over on Denman. That was one of the things that linked people. The other things that linked people was most of them showed up in electric cars. Or hybrid cars when they came to get me. So that was kind of a wow, they're walking their talk. What am I doing?
You do?
I have one now. She's right. Don't.
On Lasqueti, there was some crown land that was set aside for First Nations. You're mostly talking about private lands, but is there any sort of mechanism or movement with crown land to do more than just leave it as crown land?
Well, there was something called the Crown Land Transfer, I can't remember the formal name now. But anyway, there was a program, and every island had an opportunity through the Islands Trust Conservancy to pick one of the crown lands on their island, and many properties were protected through that. That is not running anymore because it's considered inappropriate, and that First Nations need to have access to those lands or access to at least applying for those lands, and so that program's not running anymore. Any other questions? The book is for sale. Not that I wrote the book with money, and so far I have not made a penny, but I'm hoping it'll happen a little bit. What was I going to say about the books for sale? It's for sale here. Gordon is going to, deal with it back there on your way out. And there was another question.
Oh, I had a question.
Oh, yes.
I'm just, someone brought up the point that young people starting out or somebody, just coming to the island is thrilled to see it all, but seeing some things that need to be changed or protected. They're all starting from scratch, that generation coming up. And I'm saying, would you say that your book has all the nuts and bolts?
Yeah.
To help these people see what history has done and what's the most efficient way to get moving on stuff, because they don't want to spin their wheels and waste a lot of time.
Yeah. Well, as Ken wrote at the beginning, the Rick Careless's comment was, this is a manual, but I don't like that because it's not a manual, it's an engaging story. But it does have all the bits and pieces about how to go about doing it once you finish reading all the chapters, because every island has a different way of working and different organizations that have a different focus. So, it's a good scope in terms of what one would do as a new person.
Well, is there a website that explains BC parks, that explains nature trusts, these nonprofit organizations that exist to preserve natural land?
Yeah, at the back of my book is a list of all the organizations.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Perfect.
There's also an organization, the one that I worked for 12 years, the Land Trust Alliance of BC, and so that's another place to look. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for coming and listening.